The Isle of Whithorn, at the tip of the promontory just south of Whithorn itself, is almost always referred to as simply the Isle in Wigtonshire. Wigtown Bay lies to the east, and around the headland to the west, known as Burrow Head, is Luce Bay. The Reverend C.H. Dick, in his much-loved Highways and Byways of Galloway and Carrick, says,
"It is only with an exceptionally high tide that the small spur becomes an island. Nor do the inhabitants desire that the name should be justified, for it could only be at their grave inconvenience. There are really two necks in the peninsula, and with a normal high tide, it is obvious that if the level of water were raised but a few feet, we should have two Isles of Whithorn."
And Sir Andrew Agnew, in his Guide to Wigtonshire, published in 1908, remarks,
"Why the village is called the Isle of Whithorn only becomes apparent as we walk through the street towards the pier. We then notice a spot where the beach on the east side is only separated from the harbour on the west by the causeway on which the streets run. In olden days, the sea used to meet across this point at high tides and form an island, and may still do so occasionally. The public school, which stands near the spot, has more than once had its schoolroom invaded by the sea."
And that school wasn't the only place to be invaded by the sea in this village. There haven't been a lot of changes in the Isle over the years. It has a strong, salty character, and although the priorities have changed from trade and the business of the sea to pleasure, the Isle has none of the almost imposed atmosphere of sailing and seamanship found in some modern marinas. This is a place where people have been going down to the sea in ships through many centuries. You can feel it in the wind, and perhaps imagine those early seafarers finding its safe haven. There are still links with the past. Many families have their roots back in the old days of shipbuilding and sailing ships, and there are tangible reminders everywhere. The old steam packet inn on the pier must have been attending to the needs of seamen for many generations, and its walls must be steeped with tales of the sea and fishermen's yarns. Here they could relax and enjoy the companionship and another victory over the sea, while still keeping an eye on the tides, the weather, and their own vessels moored in the little harbour outside. That tradition still carries on today, and the present landlord is John Scoular, who has lived most of his life in the village and has a deep feeling for its history.
My family has been here for a long time on my mother's side. She was born and brought up here. We had links with the old sailing families going back for a long time, and I think my granduncle would be the last customs man here. That would be at a time when there still was quite a lot of smuggling. The castle, which is the oldest building in the village, that was the headquarters of Sir John Reid, who was in command of the revenue squadron here, and quite a few of the houses were lived in by revenue cutter crews. And of course the classic story is the one about the cutter pursuing a smuggler into the harbour and thinking that he had his capture safely made, and when he came in he found that the smuggler had escaped across the small bit of land which goes underwater at high tide, and when he got in and lowered his sail he found that his prisoner was away.
A Manx lugger, laden with contraband goods, was standing off the Mull of Galloway early one morning when she was surprised by a government cutter under the command of Sir John Reid. The lugger bore away to the east under full sail with a following wind, and the government cutter gave chase. Even though the lugger piled on sail beyond the point of danger, it soon became apparent that she was being rapidly overhauled. Nonetheless, the captain held his course across Luce Bay for Cairndoon, his intended port of discharge, 5 miles to the northwest of Burrow Head. As they drew towards the land, neither vessel easing sail, there was little distance between them. With a gale blowing on shore and the tide setting strongly around the headland with high waves, fierce current and broken water, it seemed certain that the lugger wouldn't even attempt to round Burrow Head, but must soon stand to and accept capture. Sir John Reid was pleased to contemplate yet another smuggling vessel to his credit. He had reckoned without the courage and skill of his quarry, however, for swinging to starboard, the lugger's captain set his heavily laden vessel straight into the Burrow Head sea. With equal pluck, Sir John Reid turned his cutter in pursuit. It was a hair-raising 40 minutes, both vessels rearing to the dizzy crests and plunging into the trough of the waves which close at hand exploded into spray up the 150-foot cliffs. Lugger and cutter survived, however, and at length turned north into the sheltered waters of Wigton Bay. As the lugger came opposite the Isle of Whithorn, it seemed that she was giving up the fight, for she shortened sail and turned in towards the harbour. The revenue cutter drew rapidly closer, then shortened sail in turn, and followed in a more leisurely and cautious fashion. But on rounding a knoll and preparing to moor and send a ship's boat across to take the lugger captive, Sir John was astonished to discover that there was no sign of the smuggling vessel anywhere in the harbour. Officers and seamen scanned the rocking hulls and nodding forests of masts, but there was no doubt about it. Then a seaman in the rigging called and pointed through an opening in the rocks, through which the Solway was visible. Following his outstretched arm, Sir John was filled with chagrin to see the lugger standing away from the coast and setting full sail for the English shore. There was a second channel into the Isle harbour in those days, a narrow and shallow passage that was used by very small vessels at high water. Never had a vessel of such tonnage as the smuggler's lugger even contemplated it, but with full sail set and a southwest gale piling up the water in the Solway, the lugger had driven a passage straight through. It was too late for the cutter to give chase, and the lugger got clear away. Later, when the tide had fallen, they were able to inspect the big boulders which had been thrust aside, and a deep furrow 100 yards long which the lugger's keel had gouged in the shingly bottom of the channel. It was a famous escape, spoken of for many years in the southwest and all around the Solway.
Mrs. Helen McAdam and her daughter now live at the Isle of Whithorn Castle, in reality a traditional Scottish fortified tower house where Sir John Reid once lived. The McAdams are lovingly restoring the tower, which Sir Andrew Agnew tells us in his guide was built in 1674, although Mrs. McAdam says some consider it was earlier, and it has been hard to find out the full history of the castle. She doesn't know as much about it as she would like to.
The records are very scant, and of course in Scottish conveyancing the deed conveys the land and the buildings go with it, so they never name the building, so it's not possible to find out when it was actually built. The first mention that we had of it was we went to the record office in Edinburgh and spent a few days there and looked through all the minute books, and we found the deed by which Patrick Houston acquired the land, and it was a good stone house. That's how they described it, because of course there was nothing else, no other buildings around, no stone buildings, because stone was not used. And we know that he was taken to Wigton jail because he was a Covenanter, but he came out of it again because there were later deeds that we found in the minute books where he had signed as a witness. But then the Houstons just vanished, and at that time there were Houstons in Drummaston and Prestry and Tondergee and a lot of the farms round about. But in the middle of the 18th century, they just seemed to disappear. That was all the ancient history we found, and there was just an absolute gap until there are references to Sir John Reid, who lived in it in the 19th century, early 19th century, and he altered it a lot. He altered the levels of the floors, he modernised it. He blocked off the turrets, both outside and inside. He filled up the windows in the turrets on the outside, and he closed up the doorway so that you wouldn't just have thought there were imitation turrets. And we thought so until we started the hard work of pulling down all his improvements. And the turrets had obviously been used just to put junk in. They could go up into the attic and there was a gap. They could post down all the rubbish, which they did. And he was in charge of customs for the whole of Galloway, as you know. And he was charged with the murder of a young man who was a smuggler. He was trying to smuggle a cargo of salt from the Isle of Man over to Solway to get some money to get married. And Sir John Reid's cutter pursued him and fired a warning shot, but unfortunately they killed the young man. So Sir John Reid was charged with his murder, but he was acquitted, so presumably came back. But who lived in after him, we just don't know.
And Helen McAdam thinks that restoring the old tower is a challenge and worth the trouble. The sea itself is quite a challenge too. John Scoular is a keen sailor and knows the entrances and approaches to the Isle of Whithorn well, and he told me about the old false entry, which was once navigable at high tide, as we've already heard.
It's on the old charts. It's very much easier sometimes if you're coming in from seaward to see the village from the back. It looks as if the back walls of the houses are the entrance to the harbour, and quite a lot of people get caught and try and come in that way and have to be hurriedly redirected. The harbour is itself very sheltered once you're in, but the tidal streams across the entrance make it a bit tricky. It's been improved, of course, since it was extensively storm damaged and then rebuilt, and it's only really since then that the harbour has come back into major use again. There's a small number of local boats who go out to catch lobster and crab, and you've also got landings by some of the Ayrshire fleet who come down for part of the season to fish both for prawns and for whitefish. And there's still the odd visit from Fleetwood boats from the English side, especially in the winter when it's more sheltered to work here than it is further out in the Irish.
They call me Old Shirley, I work in Loose Bay. I'm happy and content in my own kind of way. With a pint in my hand, I get on the spree. If you listen, I'll sing you a song of the sea. A herring for me, a herring for me. A dear like a herring, just fresh for the sea. The mackerel are bra, the salmon and all, but I will cook it herrings, the pride of them all. If you want Old Shirley, he's done in his shed, man in his nets, before gone to his bed. Then up in the morning, awa to the sea, humming or singing this wee melody. A herring for me, a herring for me, a dear like a herring, just fresh for the sea. The mackerel are bra, the salmon and all, but I will cook it herrings, the pride of them all. I sometimes catch flatfish, I catch through this wheel. I also catch lobsters and crabs and mackerels. But all you young fellas, take a warning from me. If you want to make money, catch herring at sea. A herring for me, a herring for me. A dear like a herring, just fresh for the sea. The mackerel are bra, the salmon and all, but I will cook it herrings, the pride of them all.
The home of the silver darling.
Charlie Mcguire, the fisherman, is now in his 90s, and he spent most of his long life at sea. He's renowned as a local character, and in his younger days was very much an authoritative source of information on life at sea, fishing, folklore, and his travels. Now not so active as he was, and with failed sight, Charlie still has a phenomenal memory.
Oh, when I first went to sea, I would be a boy about 11-year-old. That was when I went to Arm 11. We were fishing lobsters, and we were fishing hand line and cod. You got the heads and the backbone and that for bait for the lobster pots, and then you would sell around the village or around the doors the filleted cod. We'd get a sixpence a pound for the filleted cod and twopence a pound for them that wasn't filleted.
What did you get for the lobsters in those days?
We'd average a shilling a pound. That would be the year's average, you see. They come down to about 5 pence and 4 pence halfpenny, and then they would go up to about 1 and 9 pence. When you were getting 2 shillings a pound for them, you thought you were made then. They were always put into boxes, and we sent them to London Billingsgate Market, to Manchester, or to Liverpool. We had a decent enough living. There was no luxuries, but we had a good enough living. There was 4 brothers of us, and we had all sections along. My brother worked for Porcherick up to the Isle of Whithorn, and then the other 2 worked up around the Borry Head, and then I worked at Monreath. We had it sewn up between us. I remember there were schooners coming here, you see, and I seen 5 schooners discharging at the one time. There would be a boat with cattle cake, and there would be another one with manure, and another one with coal, and with 5 schooners discharging at the one time.
It must have been a memorable sight, all those wonderful ships coming under sail safely into the Isle. Once oyster fishing was an important part of the local fishing industry too, with the boats coming up from Essex and the south of England, and Charlie remembers the last oysterman who lived in Whithorn. The village became a favourite place for retired seamen, and there were masters aplenty. Perhaps they felt they were almost at sea here, especially when the tide was high. One of these, Captain James S. Learmont, wrote a book called Master in Sail, in which he tells briefly of his life as a boy, first at Port William and then at the Isle, where he did not take to his new schoolmaster. So he went to sea with his father instead and never looked back. His travels covered the world, and his wife's sister, Dr. Jean Murray, still lives in what was once his cottage, surrounded by memorabilia, spectacular pictures of ships, and other mementos of a seafaring life. A picture of the captain's own ship, Ben Gairn, was painted by one John Greer, a Port William boy who went to sea as an apprentice of James Learmont's and himself later became a captain. Seamen are a superstitious lot, and seemingly trivial incidents can affect the catch, the turn of the tide, or whether a boat puts to sea at all. Here's Charlie Mcguire again.
You would never be able to speak about a minister in the boat, you know. If you had got to bring up a minister's name, you would say the man in black. My father would have had you such a coffin little rug if you had to come away with a thing like that. Well, there was lots of things were superstitious. So. And then there was a man watching on the quay wall, and my father wouldn't walk past that man going to the fishing. He'd have went away around the back road and come down to the boat that way. There was a yarn about rabbits too, and a hare. You mustn't mention a hare in a boat, you know.
Shipbuilding, trading and fishing, and of course today, sailing, have all had important roles in this tiny community. But how and why did it start? There are conflicting versions of the earliest history, but many think it became a place of pilgrimage made famous by St. Ninian, who brought Christianity to this remote part of Scotland a long time before St. Columba came across from Ireland.
Ninian's early history isn't very definite, but it's thought that he landed here, and the chapel, which is on the land behind the hotel, which is actually owned by the hotel, which makes us unusual in a pub that we own a church. The church is really, I think, a commemorative chapel marking his landing, but undoubtedly, after he set up his monastery in Whithorn, and the years after that, it was easier for people to come in pilgrimage by boat, in the early years particularly, and I think the harbour would start.
The Reverend Campbell Cowie is minister for Glasserton and the Isle of Whithorn, once separate parishes but now united, and I asked him to tell me something about Whithorn's very own saint.
Really very little is known about St. Ninian, but he lived about the year 400, which is about 150 odd years before St. Columba, and he is supposed to have belonged either to Cumberland, just across the Solway Firth, or the north of Wales. There was probably some sea traffic, you see, between those places and this district, and the Isle would always have been a seaport of some kind. Well, we think that there might have been some Christians in this part of the country, but maybe not very well organised. And he is reputed to have been the son of a king, or an important man anyway. Must have been a very clever character. But anyway, he'd assimilated all the education he could get locally, and then he went to Rome, which of course was the centre of all knowledge in those days, and was further educated there. Then he came back through France, and he stayed with Martin of Tours. This was just the beginning of the monastic movement in this part of the world, and Martin at Tours had one of the very important monasteries of the time, and Ninian would have stayed there and learned how to run a monastery, how to organise the day, how to organise food supplies, all this sort of thing, you see. So what with his Roman knowledge and his monastery knowledge, he was pretty well equipped by the time he got up here. The tradition has it that his first site was on the Cairn here, just the little island which shelters the harbour here. And then later on, he moved up to Whithorn and eventually built what is the Whithorn Priory, Candida Casa as it was called in those days. It must have taken him quite a while, because you don't just land somewhere and start building. You've got to arrange with the local kings or whatever they are. You've got to arrange for food supplies. You've got to placate the priest of whatever the local religion is and all the rest of it, you see. So it must have taken him quite a while.
And the little chapel out on the cairn there, does that commemorate him, or what sort of history does it have?
There was a an old chapel there, supposed to be 12th century. And then it was very much restored last century, and that's what you see now. There's signs of walls and so on round about it, but nobody seems to be sure just exactly what it had been. The charter for the borough of Whithorn, which was given by Robert de Bruce, it says that certain rights were given to the prior of the priory in Whithorn and so on. One of the things they had to do in return was maintain the lights at the Isle of Whithorn. So there must have been a harbour then in working order, you see.
Near the site of the chapel on the cairn is what remains of the Isle of Whithorn lifeboat station, which had a fairly unique facility. The buildings occupied what might well be called the waist of the peninsula, the land sloping equally down to a little bay at either side, so that the boat could be launched in either direction according to the prevailing winds. The harbour itself has passed through many hands, starting, it is believed, with the monastery, and then the local town council, until it went bankrupt.
After that, the harbour company was set up, basically local merchants, farmers and people who used it, and they ran it, albeit not very profitably, for very many years. They ran it, in fact, really up to the time after the war when it became badly damaged, and it was then, thanks to the good offices of the local authority with the then town clerk D.R. Wilson, he led a very effective campaign to have the damage repaired. He somehow got the money for the repair of the harbour. If it hadn't been repaired, I think that the village would have, if not died, it certainly would have not been nothing like it is today. Since that day, there's been an increasing number of both local and visiting boats using it, and it's now really quite a flourishing port, one of the most flourishing in Galloway. There's always something to watch in a harbour, and people are mesmerised by sitting on the quayside. They'll sit here for hours and just watch the tide come and go, and people working in boats and fish being landed.
The Isle of Whithorn has always had strong links with Liverpool, and many families still do.
The great connection was with the former Holt's line, the Blue Funnel line. Many people here over the years worked both as masters and various jobs, because it was much easier to go to Liverpool. If there wasn't employment locally, that's where they went. The steam packet, the Countess of Galloway, she ran regularly between the small Solway ports and Liverpool for many years. She only stopped trading when the railway came, and that was an easier link for people to use.
The Isle schooners carried cargoes all around the world, and some were built in the village, often very much a family affair, with one member the master and others running the company, and a good year was when you did not record a loss.
The McWilliam brothers, who still are businessmen in the village, they started, I think, as shipbuilders. Certainly one of them, Captain McWilliam, was a master of a schooner that they themselves built, and you can still see physical traces of the shipyard in the village.
The shipbuilding went on in the Isle of Whithorn for generation after generation. In fact, they were building ships here long before they were building them in the Clyde in Glasgow. The shipbuilding died out because the ships got too big for them to launch here.
From schooners to much smaller craft, and hanging in the steam packet are Isle of Whithorn regatta programmes going back to 1861. Do today's regattas follow the same traditions?
Yes, the regatta really is our village equivalent of village sports, and it has carried on more or less continuously outside war years. It stopped in the 20s when there was a very nasty marine accident in which people were drowned, but it resumed after the war, and it's continued really in the same kind of pattern, the same type of races that were taking place here at the end of last century, and some of the boats are still in existence that actually raced then.
There was a recent visit to the Isle by 2 Viking longboats, which seem to be part of a tradition going back 1,000 years.
The Norse links here are very much in evidence. I mean, all the little headlands here have the remains of Norse forts. There's one that these chaps would row past, Castle Feather, which is quite well known, and you can still see it from the sea. Nearly all the headlands had these small forts where these lads' predecessors came here on rather less friendly terms for a bit of rape and pillage.
Not so today, though. Apart from the storms that sometimes sweep across the rocky harbour entrance, it is peaceful in the Isle of Whithorn, and life in the village is tranquil, so that many people who come to visit return to live here, almost surrounded by the sea.